Hey guys, it's the 28th, and I'm just sitting chilling out a little bit, doing a little programming, hang out with Kara. Anyway, I was talking quite a great deal a bit about war, and it all started when I was talking about World War One because we were watching a little bit of Dark Five. I love Dark Five. You gotta check that out if you haven't seen it yet. Got some, just great production as far as doing some creepy stuff or whatever. But that's neither here nor there. That's not the point of the video. Talking about the technology in World War One and the lack of communications and why that war was so devastating. Talking about the Schlieffen Plan, which the Germans had, and Plan 13, which the French had, on how they were going to end World War One essentially in 3 weeks, because both countries, had an idea that they were going to conquer the other in 3 weeks, because the nationalistic fervor was so high, and they had all these brand new technologies and battleships and machine guns and repeating rifles and all kinds of new and very deadly technology. And so they thought, oh yeah, we'll just absolutely destroy these other guys. And they weren't too clear about what the other countries had. And when the Allied army and the Austrian the army of the Austria-Hungarian Empire clashed, they basically ended up in a situation where you've got very powerful weapons that are mowing down men, and you could not fight it in the conventional sense that they had known all the way up to then in a Napoleonic fashion. You couldn't take the advantages of terrain and encirclement and all kinds of things like that, because the battlefield commanders were not able to communicate with their men on the front lines. Initially you had signal flares. Well, that didn't work because the enemy would figure out what the flare meant, and it would ruin your plan. Or the signal flare would alert you to something was going to happen, or the enemy is something was going to happen, or it alerted the enemy to your position. So it was very ineffective. You couldn't get how many different things can you communicate with colored flares? Not very much. So the generals and commanders on the back line couldn't get that information forwarded that way. So they tried using runners. So they would give the information to the runner. The runner would run to the front, and that, of course, is going to be the first fucker that gets shot. So that didn't work. Plus, you're playing what they call the telephone game nowadays. I don't know what they called it back then. Where you've got all kinds of misinformation, because you tell one guy something, he tells somebody something, and tell the next guy something, and it's not going to be right. They couldn't get quick and accurate information about what was going on at the front back in time to respond to the ever-changing conditions of mechanized warfare. Because the first war that was fought in the industrial era was the Civil War, the American Civil War, and I'll get back to that in a second. I'm going to work my way from here back, and then I'll work forward again. And so what were they going to do as far as reconnaissance? Well, in World War One, they did have planes, but those propeller planes were only able to carry a certain payload, and typically that was just 2 passengers. And the cameras of that time were so bulky that it essentially was all the weight of a second passenger and more. So the pilot would have to go up there and fly this incredibly complicated machine that was very new at this point. Really would require an intense amount of concentration to fly it properly. And take pictures? No, and not with a camera. That, too, was kind of a difficult process at that time. So that didn't really work out very well, and they didn't get very much success with that. So aerial reconnaissance, aerial photography, they did that, but it's going to produce images that are way late, and they weren't really practical to begin with. They weren't going to really tell you anything. Then you had the hot air balloons that they sent up, and those were all well and good, but it only gave the guy in the hot air balloon the information, the real-time information as to what was going on. So even though the weapons ranges weren't good enough to knock the hot air balloons out, the guy in the hot air balloon could not communicate to the commanders on the ground or to the men on the front line the changing battle conditions. So because of all this, it was just pandemonium on the front line. And it resulted in massive amounts of casualties because you'd have your frontline commander say, go over the wall, go over the trench, go over the bridge, or whatever it may be. And with the machine guns and the artillery pieces on the other side, and the barbed wire in the middle of it, and the landmines in the middle of it, they're all dead. They didn't get any ground. World War I was not a war where either side gained that much ground. It was a friggin' slaughter. So later on, they started having the telephone lines being run up. And, well, that wasn't very effective either because the enemy could cut the line. And I think it may have been the Germans that figured this out first. Maybe the French, I don't know. Maybe the Allies. And if you know, just leave me a comment. But they figured out that they could just clip on to these these communication lines, and get everything that was command was saying back and forth. They essentially had perfect intel on what was going on in the enemy lines, and the opposition did not figure that out for quite some time. And again, more casualties. So that wasn't a reliable method of communications until they started using codes and ciphers and SIGINT intelligence. Got a little bit better, but that wasn't almost until the end of the war. And let's not forget that World War One, nobody won. Nobody won that war. An armistice was signed, and then the German people felt very betrayed by the agreement, which blamed them because they were the initial aggressors in the conflict. But the French had every intention of attacking as well. The Germans just had to. The Germans believed that they had to attack first. Whoever attacked first was going to win. That whoever had the initiative was going to win. And so both parties were very nationalistic. They were both very interested in war. It was just who was gonna strike, take the initiative, and they thought that war would be over, like I said, in like 3 weeks or 7 weeks or something ludicrous. And but the German people when the armistice was signed felt very betrayed because they didn't lose. They definitely did not lose, but they took so many awful concessions, such as they're responsible for paying for all of the costs incurred by the war and the losses and everything. This later, the Germans go on to print money to do that, to reduce their debt. And we see that happening in the United States today because of the wars that we're fighting endlessly. So they print money to pay their debts, and when people realize they're printing money, the value of the money becomes worthless. This is what I say, the Weimar Republic. I mentioned that. And the German mark collapsed to such a degree that it would literally take a wheelbarrow of cash to go buy your loaf of bread. So people were wallpapering with it. They were using it as kindling to start fire. That's how worthless their currency was. So the Germans went through a very, very hard time of economic instability, which rose later to that nationalistic fervor that allowed Hitler to gain power and allowed people to accept the fascist policies of the Nazis. I don't think that your everyday, and the Germans hid their atrocities. They hid their atrocities. This was not commonly known to the German people that the Jews were being sent to death camps and being murdered, and their wealth being confiscated. All kinds of homosexuals, Catholic priests. The Nazis wanted they and at that period in time, there was a kind of a strong belief in eugenics. Science was was the new religion, or starting to become the new religion at that period. So the Nazi leadership really believed in kind of a breeding program to create the ultimate human being, and so they committed these awful atrocities, these genocides, and I think that was a big motivator to it. Also, another motivator to that was so the Nazis could confiscate the wealth of the Jewish people. Anyway, I wasn't going to work towards World War II. I was actually going to go and work backwards towards the Civil War. Civil War being the first industrialized war. I'm not going to say mechanized like World War I was, but it definitely industrialized. They were able to produce bullets via machinery. I mean, it's not like the Revolutionary War where you had to have a blacksmith come in or your own individual soldier melt the lead, pour the lead into where you would cast the ball, and then have the ball. The manufacturing process took a long time to create ammunition, so engagements were limited by the amount of material that could be used. And the South was very limited in industrial capacity to begin with, and the industrial capacity of the North had already at that point reached a high degree of mechanization, whereas the South relied on slaves to produce agricultural products and textiles and things of that nature. So that sort of society was not very geared up for factory production. I mean, that's why slavery was such a central issue in the Civil War, because the Northerners, the rest of the world had seen slavery as a disgusting practice for a while. There was nobody else doing it except for maybe the Dutch. But I mean, the Dutch were all about that kind of shit anyway. I mean, they look at South Africa, look at Johannesburg and Cape Town and the stuff that, they was apartheid and everything there. The Dutch had no problem with slavery. I don't understand why. I'd have to kind of maybe look into that, why they were so cool with it. But even to that later period, I guess that's another investigation for another day. I don't understand. But most people at that time, it's wrong to enslave another human being. It absolutely is. Pay somebody a wage, or offer them an opportunity, but to have your freedom taken from you and forced to work or to be treated subhuman or as an animal, it's just beyond unconscionable for me to think like that. I just cannot wrap my mind around that, why that would be necessary. But they did it for economic reasons. They needed to have a labor force. I think you could still get a labor force, and you probably could have gotten a labor force from from Africans, if you gave them a fair deal and said, at the end, you get a piece of the land, you can start your own farm, like the initial indentured servants. You came over and you were basically a slave for 7 years, but then you got a little piece of something, you could start something. But people are so fucking greedy, they'd rather just own people. And because they did that, we are still facing racial problems in the United States today. And I guess it is maybe just this inherent racism that comes from cultural disconnects between people. And there's nothing that identifies you more or identifies your culture more than your appearance, because that's what people see. When a white person sees a white person, they see a white person. When a black person sees a black person, they see a black person. A white person that sees a trashy white person identifies that person as a trashy white person. A black person that sees a trashy black person identifies that black person as trashy. You see Asian people and you're able to you look at them by the color of their skin and what your knowledge is of their culture, and that definitely brings in some inherent racism, because let's be honest, nobody's a scholar and as expert a scholar to know another culture so well that you're freely able to make these determinations. Like, I feel very lucky to have been kind of exposed, I guess, to black culture and Asian culture growing up, because pretty much everybody that lived out on my end of the county that I rode the bus with, they were all black. And, I never saw them as black people. They were just people I knew that were my friends. They weren't like first black. I just knew them. I just knew them since I was a kid. And so you don't really think about that. And then taking Taekwondo for, all the years that I did, and having Grandmaster Dong teach us and having such a great respect for him and his abilities, I always had respect. I just naturally would have respect for Asian people. So I feel very fortunate to not have been raised in a racist household or a racist environment where people do actively encourage ignorance insofar as, some kind of eugenics-based nonsense about somebody else being lesser than you are just because of the color of your skin. And that is, frankly, number one, it's wrong. Number two, it's bizarre. Number three, it perpetuates ignorance. There's no need for that. So, anyway, I'm going to get back a little bit more to the Civil War here. And that's why the slavery was so central an issue. As they were taking it away, the North realized, people in the North, the abolitionists, they realized, and many people in the South realized, slavery is barbarism, and we can do better things than this. But the landholders in the South, which did not constitute the majority of the population of the people in the South, did not want to relinquish their basically their economic condition, and that's kind of greedy. So I got to say, on that end, Southern landowners were very wrong in their position on that. But that's not all the Civil War was fought about. I mean, how could wealthy landowners can muster people to fight? But there was another thing going on in the Civil War in the South that wasn't about slavery, that did energize and motivate the non-landowners. And this is the thing that is rarely discussed. That it's discussed all the time: slavery, slavery, slavery. Yeah, that was a big part of it. because the financiers in the South, the people that had wealth, were interested in keeping slaves. And but the people that didn't have those types of means to finance war, but were energetic about fighting one, was because they felt that the industrialization of the North, the way that the North was economically taking advantage of the South, how the Federalists, who wanted to consolidate federal power through the big cities of the North, through New York, through Boston, through D.C., through I don't know. There was quite a few big cities in the North. I probably don't need to go into any great length or great detail, that were trying to manipulate and control the politics and consolidate federal power to give them more control. And the people of the South still wanted to retain statehood. They still wanted to retain the rights of the state above the federal government, about states' rights, about a state's right to determination, about local communities being able to govern for themselves. They did not appreciate the taxes that were being levied by the federal government. This was an argument that was never resolved even when the Constitution was forged, about, you still had Hamilton. He was a Federalist, and you had anti-Federalists like Thomas Jefferson. And that was one thing that they knew. It was going to bubble up and be a problem later on. Because, personally, and everybody can have a different opinion on this, because when it comes to arguments, sometimes there is no absolute right and absolute wrong. Sometimes it's just the way it is. It's not. Sometimes things are not mathematic. You have to be at least open-minded and flexible enough to say, hey, maybe we're in a situation where nobody's right, and maybe we're in a situation where nobody's really that wrong. But my personal opinion is states do need to have the right to self-determination to the highest degree that they can. And the reason I say that is because if we all collectively just had the federal government for national defense and, to act as diplomats and represent the interests of the nation as a whole, make large purchases, deal with foreign entities, then states could concentrate on creating the best local governance that they had, and then the values of the community that's in the state could be reflected by their government, because there is no one size fits all for people. People are different, and I like to cherish and celebrate these differences rather than try and stomp them out and tell somebody what they can say, they can't say, what they can believe, what they can worship. Believe in freedom. And if you believe in freedom, you're still going to have opinions. You're still going to have an idea of the way that you want to live your life, or your life should be lived. And there are people that are going to be like-minded with you, and you can go, if you had states, that were separate, that didn't have to always abide by the federal government's mandates. You could basically go and choose to be with like-minded people. You could choose to be in your community. If you didn't like the theocratic, Calvinistic attitudes of the people up in the Northeast, you didn't have to deal with that. You could go move somewhere else. Or, if you did have a really strong religious bent, and you were a Mormon and you wanted to practice Mormonism, and you were ostracized pretty much everywhere else, you could go and live in Utah. If you wanted to be a polygamist, if you wanted to do this, if it was permissible in your community, then you would do it. The idea behind that I believe it was either Locke or Mill. That is, I think it's John Locke. If you're not hurting anybody else, then you can go ahead and do it. Just don't. If you put yourself in a position where your belief is infringing on someone else's freedom, or happiness, or their economic welfare, or the collective good, I think is also to be considered in that. That wasn't in his argument specifically. Go ahead, should be able to go ahead and do it. And that was like one of the major things that's not discussed in the about the Civil War, because it's overshadowed by slavery. And but you have to realize that there were other reasons that people were fighting that war, and these things are still not resolved today. They're not. I mean, I am glad that we are one nation united. I am glad of that, no doubt. It would not be a good thing for the United States to be split in two. A house divided will never stand. But I do wish that states and people had more of a right to self-determination, to decide what's good for their communities, because local community governance is always going to be the best governance, because it always has been. It always has been. That's just the way it goes. You can't have a king or somebody that's so far removed, or some power-hungry president in the executive branch, or some dickhead sitting in a room in D.C., miles away from his constituents, making decisions about what his or her constituents are going to do when they're so far removed from their community. And then, because they are far removed from their community and they're not as beholden to their community, they don't face the consequences of the people of their community. And it kind of gives them a pass to be corrupt, because it's very difficult to bring them to heel, or bring some accountability into it if your representatives are not nearby. And the state legislatures even are kind of ridiculous in many respects, because their power has been usurped by the federal government, who's always coming around and dropping this helicopter money that's not real. It wasn't printed by the United States government. It was printed by the Federal Reserve Bank to give to the federal government, and the federal government reimburses them with bonds that say IOU. And that's how money comes into existence. The federal government says, I owe you now, Federal Reserve Bank, for this money. And then, which they didn't do shit for, they just printed it up. And they send it to your local governments and your state governments in the form of these huge grants. And for, whatever, it could be infrastructure projects. It could be to militarize your police. It could be to, some economic disaster recovery or something, which is a good thing if it was real United States money being used for that. Or we could all collectively as states contribute to this fund, and it wouldn't be rated to protect areas that need to be rebuilt from natural disaster, because it would be like an insurance policy, because states can go bankrupt. We're seeing it right now, to help if a natural disaster would force them into bankruptcy. That would be kind of our insurance policy on that. Like Social Security was supposed to be our safety net when we got old, until they looted that in the 90s. Well, let's see. I kind of get off track because I get pretty passionate about these types of things. So mine tends to race. But Where was I? I was talking about. What was I talking about?
Natural selection.
What's that?
Natural selection.
Natural selection. I don't remember saying anything about natural selection.
About how the government's just printing money.
Yeah, their money pretty. Oh, right. Okay, what I was going to say to further that point would be, so what they do is they send down these huge grants, and if the state governments or the municipalities don't comply with the federal government's demands on what they do, they're like, all right, give us the money back. Take all that money back. You owe it now. So it's debt slavery. The federal government uses that tool of enslavement just like the bankers do. It's quite ludicrous. I mean, I actually thought not long ago here in my community in Sarasota. Okay, it's one of the wealthiest cities per capita in the United States. It might be the wealthiest per capita, but that's on the other side of the bridge. I'm on the I live in the section of town that's like the other side of the railroad tracks, so they wouldn't even allow me over the bridge. And I think if you're driving around there, the cops will come over there and be like, you don't live here. Get the fuck out of here. I mean, freedom ain't free, buddy. Get the fuck back over the bridge. There's people are that rich over there, but I don't care to go over there anyway. So I only got one friend over there. He's old and almost dead anyway. I love him though, and that's another conversation again for another time. But as I saw money velocity slowing down to a crawl, and we've got the Ringling School of the Arts, and I went to VCU, which is also an art school, a top-notch art school. Ringling is a top-notch art school. So we have got all these very highly educated young people that are skilled in the arts, and they leave. Like the kids that come up here, they go to school, they leave because there's no opportunity here for them. There's a little opportunity, and like I've said before about Sarasota, it is a competitive city to live in. Like they will run your ass out of town because you've got to be the best. And I see people come here all the time and they don't make it, and they go back to the Midwest, they go back wherever it's they're from. So, and I speak from experience. I got ran out of here one time, and I went back to Virginia because I wasn't doing the things that I needed to be doing to survive down here. You just don't get to survive here and not be on top of the game. But how am I going to make it so that these artists and these phenomenal bronzesmiths that I work with, I mean, world class, literally, I mean, world class production, art, things that I've never been able to believe could be made out of metal, and the way that it has to be gated, and all these other little things that you can't